My name is Nellie Brown. I'm a certified industrial hygienist, and I'm director of the Workplace Health and Safety Program, which is part of the School of Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell University. I do all kinds of training and technical assistance on occupational safety and health issues, and give these types of programs as well as fieldwork across New York State, as well as delivering things virtually wherever you might be. I'm joined today by my colleagues Stephanie Olszewski and Veronica Moore. Veronica will be monitoring the Q&A. So if you have questions, please put them into the Q&A rather than the chat box, because it gives her one place to look, which is a lot easier than trying to watch two places at the same time. I'm also affiliated with the Buffalo CoLab, which stands for Collaborative Work, and involves a lot of work with other workplaces, communities, and so on. So I'm going to begin our program and start sharing my screen. Please, if you have questions, put them into the Q&A, and Veronica will feed them to me during the program. This is one of a series of programs that I'm doing for the Worker Institute at Cornell ILR. Today, we're going to be taking a look at occupational stress, sources and solutions. This is a 1-hour program, so it's pretty condensed. But if you have, of course, further questions or concerns, or you'd like to have me deliver a program specifically for your workplace, do contact us. Be happy to do longer programs as well. So today we're going to be taking a look at this issue of stress in the workplace. Well, when it comes to, of course, occupational stress, we experience it as individuals. Things that bother some people may not bother us, and vice versa. So it's really important to take a look at this, realizing that as we explore stress, we're really looking at it through the lens of the individual as well as that of the organization. Of course, going through the pandemic has been a difficult ordeal for all of us. A recent Stress in America survey looked at the respondents saying, are they experiencing stress from the current pandemic? We recognize that the pandemic has been affecting us in so many ways. We're social animals, and we miss each other, being cut off from other people, not being able to socialize as much, having tremendous demands. If you're an essential worker, on your time, having to balance work and family demands. These things have all been very difficult, along with dealing with the disease itself, and of course, experiencing illness or even death in friends and family. So what we have found is that people are indeed experiencing effects, both mentally and physically, on their health. And we've seen these effects show up in people gaining weight, losing sleep, turning to various chemical support, such as alcohol use, or as I like this quote from Dr. Gupta, that in the midst of a global pandemic, we've all changed. I joke that you've either become a chunk, monk, hunk, or drunk. And pretty silly way to look at it, but it is real. This is very real. So I'd like to start out with a little bit of a look at where you think you would place your job. And I'd like to view it through two dimensions: the psychological demands of your job, the pressures to perform, to meet standards of production or quality, whatever it is that your job requires of you. Do you feel those demands are low or high? And at the same time, how much control do you feel you have over how you use your job, resources, your time, and so on? What sort of decision latitude do you really have to control these various aspects of your job? Again, do you feel those are low or high? So place your job where you feel it belongs in one of those quadrants, and we'll process this exercise a little later in today's program. Okay, so when we talk about stress, how should we define it? One of the early researchers in stress, Dr. Hans Selye, defined stress as the wear and tear of living. And since it's a part of life, we can't avoid it. Well, certainly stresses can be positive or negative, although today we're concentrating so much on the negative side of stress. But stress can be a powerful motivator. It can drive us. We can, for example, even compete with ourselves as we set ourselves various goals. But we can also be very driven as well. Now, when it comes to stress, I always like to remind people that we today literally are still living in the bodies of our ancestors. So the stress responses that we have built into our bodies and brains are very much like what our ancestors had, but we live in a world that's very different from theirs. So a lot of these stress adaptive responses we have were designed to protect us in situations that might very well be life-threatening. It's just that a lot of times today, what we respond to are not necessarily life-threatening issues or situations, yet we respond with these same mechanisms. So we have, in fact, adaptive responses to stress in both the short and long-term experience of it. In the short term, our stress response has often been nicknamed fight or flight. It involves the body secreting high amounts of adrenaline and related hormones, which gear us up to respond quickly to what we think of as a very dangerous situation, such as, say, in an early man, the attack of a wild beast, in which case our body gears up to respond rapidly with either defense or fleeing whatever the problem is. Now, of course, what this means is that adrenaline and other hormones cause our heart to beat rapidly. Our blood vessels dilate so that we can get blood rapidly out to the extremities, our limbs, so that we can run or fight or whatever we need to do. At the same time, we widen the focus of our eyes so that we can take in more information visually, including quite a bit from the periphery, which can make it a little more difficult to focus in the center of your visual field. A lot of times when we're stressed, people say, oh, I can't seem to focus on anything. I can't read anything, whatever. And again, that's exactly what is happening to you. Where our hearing becomes more acute, our breathing more rapid so we can send more oxygen out to the limbs and power the muscles. So all of these things gear us up, and our body puts more sugar into the bloodstream to gear us up for rapid use of energy. Now, we also, as it turns out, have a stress response that enables us to address problems that are more long-term. Once again, I'm teaching on Zoom and I have a visiting cat. So how about chasing a Super Bowl? Go for it, cat. Okay, so long-term stress response tends to be fueled by other hormones such as cortisol. People have nicknamed this response the vigilance response because it was originally studied in people who were on call for various types of jobs. Now, this stress response tends to be turned on after we've experienced some type of short-term stress that's repeating itself over and over again. Our brain sort of looks at the stress and says, wow, this is going on for a long time, usually something on the order of 3 to 4 weeks, close to a month or so. And so it begins to generalize the problem and turn on a long-term stress response. Now, in early man, this probably would have been a tremendous advantage surviving things that go on for weeks or months, such as extremes in the weather, dealing with food deprivation, such as difficulty in making it through a harsh winter, or environmental catastrophes like dealing with earthquakes, droughts, and volcanic eruptions, and so on. Now, one of the things we've learned over the years is that if you look back at studies in humans and in animals about stress, you tend to find that a great deal of the research, easily close to 85% of it, was actually done in men and male animals. So when these researchers look back at these studies and looked at the 15% of female subjects and their response, they noticed that something else is going on. It's not just a fight or flight response, that in fact, in women and female animals, there was a nurturing type of response that the researchers nicknamed tend and befriend. You would see this in both humans and in animals, where they would turn to each other, they would nurture each other. In humans, they would talk together, they would come up with solutions and discuss the problem, and so on. And so we realize there's something else going on here. There is, in fact, another hormone, oxytocin, being secreted at this time. Oxytocin seems to work much better in women. It works together with estrogen, not so well in men working with testosterone. And as a result, we tended to feel oxytocin is more of a nurturing type of hormone, and it was apparently behind the behavior that was observed in these studies. So we realized that in times of short-term stress, our responses actually can be rather varied. But certainly if the stress is perceived by us as going on for a long time, 3 or 4 weeks or more, the body changes over. Instead of turning adrenaline on and off and on and off and on and off, it instead converts our response into the chronic stress form, elevating cortisol and other hormones instead. In other words, intending us to survive for the long haul. Now, to give you an idea of what happens when cortisol, one of the stress hormones, is elevated for the long haul, there are some serious disadvantages to this particular response. For example, when cortisol is elevated for long periods of time, it begins to stimulate the body and trade off various resources against each other. Normally, cortisol as a hormone tends to produce alertness. It usually cycles on a 24-hour pattern. In other words, it has a circadian rhythm to it, and it tends to rise in the early morning and wake you up, and it tends to drop towards the evening, making us want to go to sleep. It shouldn't stay elevated all the time. When it does, it tends to cause a number of different trade-offs in the body. One of them is suppression of the sex hormones. Now, of course, in early man, it's easy to understand why this might be useful. After all, for example, food is in very short supply. This is probably not a good time to reproduce. On the other hand, in today's world, this removes one of what I would call our stress relievers. Elevated levels of cortisol over the long haul tend to cause the body to increase its secretion of gastric acid. In other words, our stomach is able to make use of any bit of food that comes along, digest it very thoroughly, work on it really well. Of course, this means long-term stress can give us various symptoms in the digestive tract, suggesting why people often need acid controllers when they're experiencing a lot of stress. We tend to find that, again, trade-off of resources in the body. We depress the immune system, making us, in periods of long-term stress, more susceptible to infections and to cancers. Remember, our immune system also picks off abnormal cells as well and defends us against a lot of early cancers. So what we have here is a tendency to get more illnesses, and especially viral ones. We find that our proportion of natural killer cells, white blood cells that go after viruses, tends to be depressed when we experience a lot of stress. Now, since cortisol is an alertness hormone, having it elevated all the time makes us cranky and irritable. We're hyper alert. We find that we, at the same time, deplete the serotonin in the brain, which is needed to regulate mood and sleep cycles. So people under a lot of stress are not able to be very resilient, and they tend to have difficulty sleeping, which adds to your stress. Cortisol staying elevated all the time also causes the body to manage its resources very tightly. It tends to put more of the food we eat into storage as fat. So people with stress tend to gain weight. They also tend to retain salt, particularly, of course, meaning sodium, which, of course, in about a quarter of the population, translates into elevated blood pressure as well. Again, another risk with stress is high blood pressure. Now, while we're busy saving the sodium, we tend to do a not so good job with potassium and magnesium. We lose these essential minerals, also needed for good health of the nervous system and body generally. Now, when stress persists for long periods of time, we begin to find that there is some damage happening to the striated muscle of the heart, particularly around the pacemaker. Now, we've just seen in autopsies of people experiencing chronic stress and then sudden death is that they actually developed small little fractures between the cells of the heart muscle. And as a result, the electrical signal from the pacemaker was unable to jump across the heart muscle and trigger it. And as a result, people ended up with sudden cardiac death. Early signs of this with stress tend to show up on the electrocardiogram as erratic heart rhythms. Now, of course, as we're busy moving all that fat around between storage depots, we find elevated fats and cholesterol in the bloodstream, which can contribute to the risk of heart attack as well. And of course, stroke. Now, if all of these haven't convinced you that chronic stress is something we absolutely need to take charge of, we also have something else that happens here with stress, and that is that stress can shrink the brain. We have seen chronic stress decrease the rate at which new nerve cells are produced in a part of the brain called the hippocampus. The hippocampus is what processes short-term memory, helping us, of course, with learning and then putting learning into storage later when we sleep. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, as the hippocampus begins to, over time, shrink in size, this appears also to be a cause of depression. Now, and the problem with this reduction in size of the hippocampus is people begin to experience these problems of processing short-term memory. We can have literally difficulty learning and remembering even things that should be habits, things that we might do even as part of our daily life. So, my point about this is that these are great natural survival mechanisms. And if our lives were actually being threatened, this would be terrific. Except that so much of the circumstances we live in today may not necessarily be stresses that are truly life-threatening. Or they might be things that we anticipate, in other words, things we worry about, even if they never happen. As Mark Twain would say, I worried about a lot of things in my life, some of which actually happened. Now, of course, researchers on stress would say that this is great because if you can anticipate something going wrong, you can plan for it and forestall it. If, in fact, you respond to similar things in the future, you're more likely to survive them. But at the same time, it can make us a bit of a sad species. Now, when we think about all this research saying that we have a variety of different stress responses, they might differ a bit with gender and so on, you have to realize that so much of what we experience as stress depends upon our life history, our past experiences, the things we responded to in the past that we want to respond to in the future faster and better. So this means that as individuals, what might trigger our stress response could vary, and how we then react to that stress can vary. For some people, our stress reaction might be flight. We feel fear and anxiety. We wish we could run, but let's face it, if what we're worried about is something happening at work, we can't exactly simply run out of our, and leave our jobs. That may not be an easy thing to do. Now, what if your individual stress response is a wish to fight? Well, the problem is punching out a supervisor or coworker is probably not going to be good for your career. So you might feel anger or frustration because you feel the desire to fight, but you can't really carry that out. Now, for some people, the responses become so confused that people really get into a panic. They may even be paralyzed in terms of what they think they ought to be able to do and what actions they can take. And they're just simply in a state of literally being frozen. Now, for some people, their response, especially if they learn some good coping skills, is to think about ways they could be resourceful, how they might seek out resources that could be helpful, maybe look at a way to convert the current threat into a challenge. How can I rise to this challenge, and what would it take to help me do that? Some people find themselves coaching themselves through whatever the stress is, figuring out a way to reduce the threat in the mind, even if you can't necessarily reduce it in reality. One common approach people might use is to figure out a way in your mind that you can laugh at that source of stress. You might make fun of the person who is stressing you out. You might not be able to voice it, but you can think it. You might figure out a way to poke fun at the incident itself, or to figure out a way to reduce the threat simply by comparing it to something else and saying, okay, what's the worst thing that could happen to me here? Okay, how might I deal with that? All right, what's the next worst thing? And so we begin to reduce the threat and its appearance of danger. Now, I'd like to try a little exercise with you. I'm not going to ask you to give any feedback on it, but think about what this might mean. I'd like you to think about some memory or event, something that happened when you were a child. I'd be willing to bet that the way that you remember it is because it had a strong emotion associated with it. You know, when we store our memories, we attach an emotional tag to them. And of course, the size of that tag proportionately is related to the strength of the emotion we felt at the time. Now, was that emotion positive or negative? I've run this exercise many, many times in live classrooms where I've asked people to raise their hand if it was a positive emotion. They felt that it was neat, it was great, I was happy, it was fun, it was terrific. That's why I remember it. Or are they raising their hands because it was negative? It was awful. I was scared. I don't know how I was going to survive, and it was terrible. And I tend to find the negative responses very, very much outweigh the positive ones. That's because we have a bias in our memory forming section of the brain, and that is that we tend to remember the bad things that happened to us better than the good ones. Again, researchers will say, yes, but that is going to enable you to survive better in the future. If it was something bad that happened to you, you'll be geared up to respond better and faster next time, and you'll survive it. But at the same time, again, it makes us a bit of a sad species. Now, a lot of times, to cope with the emotions that arise when we experience stress, we try to do this by affecting the pleasure center in the brain. For example, we might try to make our brain feel better by, if we're a smoker, smoking more. If, for example, we're having trouble dealing with our inability to sleep and therefore we need more caffeine to stay awake, we start taking in more caffeinated drinks, coffee, tea, soft drinks that are caffeinated, and you can take in a lot more calories that way too. For some people, the way to make the brain feel better is to turn to alcohol or drugs. In fact, right after September 11th, the sale of sleeping pills, laxatives, painkillers, cough medicine, and tranquilizers all went up over 30%. So were we treating our stress with chemistry? Yes, we were. We even use food to help us with this as well. Now, food can in fact do some tremendous changes to the brain chemically. For example, if stress wears you out, you might find yourself relying more on sweet snacks. If you're the person who wants to feel more in control of whatever the stressor is, you might go to salty snacks. And if stress makes you feel very lonely and unloved, you might turn to fattier foods or comfort foods, things that remind you of something in your childhood or that someone who loved you made for you. And so you turn to those comfort foods. Chocolate being a great one for that. Chocolate affects the brain's pleasure center in a way that makes us feel as though we feel we're loved. So does the smell of roses. Now you know why for Valentine's Day, we give people chocolate and roses. But the problem here is that these things can be overdone. So how might we tackle stress? Well, one option, of course, is to teach the person experiencing the stress how to cope better or adapt to it. This tends to put the onus on the person and says, well, you are simply not handling stress very well, so you need more skills to do it. In the US, stress research is frequently focused on these kinds of what I will call person-oriented cures. So a lot of promotion has been done on things like relaxation therapy, humor therapy, self-awareness therapy, and so on to deal with stress. These do work and they are helpful, but they are only one approach that we could take. And the problem with concentrating only on option one is that these efforts really concentrate on the person on your individual biology, your psychology, your behavior, your lifestyle, and so on. And they do offer an easy solution in the sense that they're a great alternative for workplaces when, in fact, the need is really to address more complex and difficult labor management negotiations over workplace control. So, what about another option? Well, this one is to attack the stressor itself. Can we change or modify it? Now, this option assumes the problem is really with the condition or event, perhaps, or person that causes the stress. Now, research does tend to support the conclusion that it's not really the demands of work itself which adversely affect health. I mean, that is, work that can be demanding, but within limits. It's not the big problem here. But it tends to be more the organizational structure. It makes people feel that they lack control over how they meet the demands of the job, how they use their skills, their time, and so forth. So let's think about these two options. First, what could the organization do to reduce stress? Well, there is some very good research in this area. Things that have been, in fact, very well replicated over time. And we do find there are some characteristics, some common threads that run through workplaces that are both healthy and low stress, according to the people who work there, and yet have high levels of productivity. So what is it that these workplaces are doing well? Well, they tend to be workplaces that recognize employees for good work performance. You know, we often tend to tell people when they screw up, but we forget that people want to be praised for when they do well. And, you know, we'll go the extra mile, you know, as workers for a praise. We want to be recognized for good performance. You tend to find that another common thread is where there are good opportunities within a workplace for development of a job as a career. Now, certainly for some people, a job is just a job. But for people who feel that they want a career in this particular field, they want to go further, what can the workplace do to help them with that, show them what is needed to reach the next step and the step beyond that, and so on? Another common and important thread is having an organizational culture that values the individual worker. You know, nothing's more demeaning than to have an employer say to you, you don't like it here? Well, you're replaceable. Don't let the door slap you on the way out. We don't want to be treated as though we're simply a workplace cog, a part that someone else can just plug in another part in place of us. That is very, very demoralizing. And finally, if there's one thing that people in a workplace notice very well, it's the double message. So we need to make sure that management actions are consistent with organizational values. In other words, if an organization says safety is number one, but what people observe is that production is what's number one and safety is way down the list, people know that they're being told a falsehood. They see that every day. So what are some things that might make a difference here? We know that organizations can destroy the trust of their employees, and there are ways that this can happen. So can we recognize them and do something about them? One thing that people recognize very easily in a workplace is an organization that won't own its own mistakes. So what might those mistakes be? It might be people's behaviors that are unacceptable, that workers experience harassment or bullying or discrimination, or other types of behaviors. Because there's a big difference here between a demanding workplace and a demeaning one. Or it could be a workplace where policies or decisions that are just not working well. You know, a lot of things that might have started out looking like good ideas are just not working. They could be scheduling, they could be work conditions, they could be techno-stress, the stress of the technology, especially new technology and adapting to it, and so on. Circumstances change. People, plans, decisions now don't work out. So it's important for an organization to find out why, make the changes needed, and understand how employees feel about what went wrong. Another way that organizations destroy the trust of their employees is not closing the communication loop. When an organization asks for feedback, it needs to also demonstrate it's heard what people are saying and then is making changes based on that information. If there's anything that people get annoyed about, it's constantly having themselves surveyed or being part of a focus group or discussion, and then they see no impact on the organization. Over time, those things undermine people's trust. I talked just a moment ago about the idea of organizations showing how it takes someone to develop their career further. So, an organization needs to invest in career path. So, employees need to believe the organization is interested in having a long-term relationship with them, seeing them grow and develop. So, a great way to make that happen is invest in people's future. Provide resources to do it, maybe in-house seminars, maybe mentoring programs, things that maybe people can use to develop themselves further in a job. And remember, resources might be money or discounts towards further education, even if that takes place, of course, outside the organization. And so that people might go for a further degree or complete a degree they started and so on. And another one that undermines people's trust is when they see in a workplace significant pay inequities. These can be due to big disparities among people who have similar jobs, because this undermines people's sense of fairness. It might also be sharp differences between pay for executives and frontline workers, especially when the difference is so many multiples that seem really exaggerated relative to people's importance in the organization. Okay, so let's go back to that little exercise we started with, the job demand versus job control exercise. In what quadrant did you place your job? Typically, people who place themselves in the lower right quadrant, that I've labeled quadrant 1, tend to be people experiencing very high psychological strain and even physical illness as a result of that from their jobs. So how might we move them up into quadrant 2? Well, in this quadrant, people tend to feel that their ideas contribute to the workplace. They feel very invested in their jobs. They feel that as individuals, their work is highly valued. There are opportunities for them to have a real influence on how the job is done. Now, what this means is moving people from quadrant 1 into quadrant 2 means giving them more control over their job. It might be forming teams on how to solve a particular workplace problem. It might be allowing people to do their own scheduling. Remember, management isn't giving up any authority here, but by drawing on their employees for ideas and for help here, we end up with people more invested in their job. And when they feel they're in more control, they tend to find themselves experiencing less stress. Now, people who put themselves up here in quadrant 3 tend to be people who use a great deal of creativity in their jobs. You often find artists, architects, engineers often placing themselves here, basically because they feel they use so much creativity at work, they don't feel the demands are a problem at all. So they feel themselves very much in control. Now, people who put themselves down in the lower left quadrant tend to have jobs that they feel are just a job. They often feel themselves, really getting more of their rewards in life outside the job because the job seems very perfunctory and very routine. We often find people like security guards putting themselves into this quadrant. Basically, they say, I make my rounds, I look at different things, and so on, but it doesn't really demand a lot of me on this job. And so I don't really feel I have a lot of myself really contributing to how the work is done. Now, sometimes chronic stress goes on for such a long time that people feel that they are experiencing burnout. The International Labor Organization, ILO, has now classified this really as a true occupational illness. It's typically characterized by some symptoms that I described down here in the lower right. People feel a lack of motivation. They show a lack of resilience. They have bad interactions with others. Again, chronic stress makes us irritable, cranky, and lose our bounce and resilience. And we often find ourselves having an inability to make good decisions. We really just feel very drained. So this particular problem has been defined as a syndrome. There are several of these different factors that lead to us calling it this, and it reflects the fact that this is chronic, in other words, long-term stress that has not been successfully managed. It might be the result of a single critical incident. It might be work conditions that are going on for long periods of time. People feel that their energy is very depleted. They're very, very drained. They feel an increased mental distance from their job. They literally feel like they're not contributing much. They feel very negative or cynical about it. And they do feel that their performance is seriously affected, what some people will describe as a reduced professional efficacy. They just feel like they're not really producing good quality work. Okay, so let's take a look at the other option. What are some things we can do to take care of ourselves? Keep in mind that I'll be concentrating on things that have good underlying science that enable us to take charge and hopefully restore the hormonal balances that have been so upset. Now, of course, I tend to think that any kind of a solution for stress means we need both option one and option two, because we can't always fix the workplace right away, and we do need to take care of ourselves along the way. Okay, one thing that is very important is using our sense of humor more. Humor is actually a very powerful tool. And we found that when people take a little bit of a light touch in regards to their jobs, that their stress level is indeed reduced quite a bit. We find that humor normalizes body chemistry. It reduces the stress hormones. We literally break them down and excrete them at a faster than normal rate. This is very helpful in dealing with our health. We also know that there's wiring in the brain that indicates we evolved to laugh. Laughter is an important human characteristic. And we know that because we can see, among other things, that there's a pattern to laughter. You know, when you laugh, there's a certain sound that you'll make and you'll keep it. For example, if you start out laughing with a ha, you'll go on going ha, 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 ha until you run down. You don't change in the middle and go ha, ha, he, he, ho, ho. So we recognize there are rules in the brain for laughter. We have seen in studies that laughing improves our health. It has effects on every body system. It enables us to secrete more endorphins and reduce pain temporarily. We know that body systems are improved. It improves our respiration, our circulation, our digestion, and reduces our blood pressure. It also increases immune system activity, and it tends to banish negative emotions. Laughter soon before sleeping helps us to get to sleep better. In other words, it counteracts all of these different adverse effects that we saw stress doing to us. In fact, exuberant laughter, where you're using your belly muscles and you actually get tired, can work on the body much like aerobic exercise does, which we'll talk about shortly too. In fact, 20 seconds of a deep belly laughing guffaw is equivalent to 3 minutes of a hard rowing exercise when it comes to the health of the heart. We've also seen in longevity studies that people who report into their 90s past 100 that they used a sense of humor to deal with a lot of things in their life, they actually live longer. So it adds years to your life and not just life to your years. In one recent study, 7.5 years difference in using more humor in your life. Remember, as a child, you would have laughed hundreds of times a day. We really sober up as humans, don't we? Now, when it comes to the value of laughter, I want you to realize that you may not feel much like laughing. Well, keep in mind that you can fake it till you make it. Making yourself laugh also works because the body doesn't know it's fake, even though the brain does. So take a minute even to reflect on what makes you laugh out loud so you can build more of it into your life. For example, are there ways you can find humor in everyday life? Little things that happen to you that'll make you laugh. For example, one day I found that a squirrel had dug a hole in a trash bag and pulled out a little bitty bulb that had been used in a nightlight. It looked very much like an acorn, and apparently he thought it was because he went and buried it. I don't think, however, that's where we get Christmas trees from. Now, one technique you could try is think about how your favorite comic would react. For example, I might reflect on, how would Jerry Seinfeld cope with the problem aspect of my job? What would he come up with? You could have a laughter library. That way, when you've had a bad day, are there things you can draw on? Movies you know are guaranteed. If you watch them or stream them, they're going to work out for you. Or your favorite comic, watching a movie or streaming that person. You can listen to audio CDs, MP3s, or the radio of comedians in your car when you're commuting. You can read funny books, have cartoon collections, just things you can draw on that you know. You can watch, Blazing Saddles, and it'll get you laughing, and you'll have an end to your day that's a lot more relaxing. There are services that'll mail jokes to you. And spending time with people who have a similar sense of humor, so you spark each other into laughter, is valuable too. Okay, another powerful self-care tool is exercise. Again, it works in the body similar to what we saw with humor. It causes the body to break down and excrete the stress hormones, so it begins to normalize their blood levels for us. Now, when it comes to exercise, it has very profound effects on us. It literally changes the chemistry of the muscles. We begin to burn fat more efficiently by storing more fat-burning enzymes and keeping them at higher levels. We also secrete more body messengers called cytokines that stimulate tissue to grow and repair. If you're just a couch potato, unfortunately, a lot of the circulating cytokines tend to promote age and decay. So exercise is like sending a message back to the body saying, look, I'm using this, so keep fixing it. Now, all exercise, any type, is valuable. It's just that some types are more efficient for certain types of health goals, depending on what you want to do. Now, it's also important to consider when exercise is valuable also by getting outside into nature. Japanese call this forest bathing, but we've seen profound effects to the body with it. It actually is known to improve the immune system and to change the microbiome in our gut to more desirable organisms. Now, exercise comes in a variety of forms. I'm going to emphasize two forms for you today. One is aerobic. Aerobic is endurance exercise. It burns both sugar and fat, so it needs to use a lot of oxygen. It has a tremendous range of benefits, among them improving the health of the heart, reducing body fat levels and increasing lean muscle mass, and of course, reducing stress. Now, for it, you're going to use the big muscles of the lower body. But if you can't do that, there are upper body ergometers that use the arms. They're like bicycles for your upper body. Now, whatever exercise you do, whether it's walking or running or jumping on a trampoline or jumping rope or riding a bicycle indoors or outdoors, whatever exercise you do, you want to do it fast enough, but at a comfortable pace that doesn't get you out of breath because you need a lot of oxygen to burn that fat. Now, what you want to do is build up to your pace, and once you reach your pace, do it for at least 12 minutes. Of course, more will be better, but that's the minimum amount shown to make these wonderful changes in the body and reduce your stress levels. Now, other important exercise to keep in mind is more on the non-aerobic, really kind of the side of things, because it uses sugar and doesn't need a lot of oxygen, sugar already being a partly oxidized molecule. But it does do a lot to improve the strength of muscles and maintain the health of bone. This is exercise that involves lifting weights, it could be separate weights or your own, the way you might do in a push-up, or working with things like exercise bands. What it does is put pressure on muscle and bone. Again, sending a message back to the body, I'm using these bones, so keep fixing them. And it helps to stave off osteoporosis as well. Now, with exercise, every little bit you do through the day adds up, but it is nice to measure progress. So how might you benchmark yourself? Well, you could certainly get your body fat level measured, and that's probably the very accurate way to do it. But another thing you might do is take your measurements, measure your waist to hip ratio, and watch it change. Of course, you can watch your clothes getting looser too. And this is important rather than just watching your body weight change. Sometimes people do good workouts, have a nice diet for a month or so, get on the scale and find they've actually gained a few pounds, but their clothes are looser. So yes, we're shifting the weight around, burning that fat, and building a little bit heavier and denser muscle. So whatever exercise you do, pick activities you enjoy, because if it's fun, you'll build good habits, and consistency really pays off. Also, don't set anything that's an unrealistic goal and then give up because you can't reach it. Now, keep in mind that it's always good to get good medical consultations to make sure you're doing exercises correctly. And if you're having any kind of muscle or joint problem, get good physical therapy. We want to stay safe doing exercise. Now, another big problem for us as Americans is, as a culture, we are terribly sleep deprived. And sleep is necessary to support life and health. It's not something you can just get by on less. Really, you can't. I talk a lot about this in my workshops on shift work and long hours of work. And I can give you a lot more detail. But think about this. How many hours a night do you sleep? Sometimes when I'm doing live programs, I will ask people this question. And when I ask if anyone's getting more than 8 hours, I get a lot of laughter. Well, unfortunately, a lot of people are getting less than they should have. As humans, we typically as a species need around 8 to 9 hours of sleep a night. Now, why might we need that much sleep? Well, it's because we're doing very important things while we're sleeping, some of which cannot be done while we're awake. So we can't get by on simply less. Now, of course, we sleep at different stages, some of them very shallowly asleep, and as I show in this figure, some of them very deeply asleep. And of course, we can drop very quickly into deep sleep, which is where the expression falling asleep comes from. In fact, sometimes we fall asleep in such that we startle ourselves and we come awake real quickly because we thought we were falling down a hole. And that's because our muscles relax so rapidly that we actually thought we were falling. Through the night, our bodies and brains shift through a variety of different activities. We repair muscle, and especially in the first 90 minutes or so of sleep, we secrete growth hormone, and we repair a lot of muscle. We also test body systems, turning them on and off and checking them to make sure they work well. We also spend, as you can see, part of our sleep cycles in REM sleep, abbreviation for rapid eye movement, because our eyes are moving rapidly under our closed eyelids. Now, all of these different portions of sleep are necessary because we're doing important activities. Recently, we discovered in studies of people sleeping in MRI machines that a good portion of what we do when we're sleeping is brain housekeeping. Even when we're awake, our resting brain cells are still using a lot of energy to package chemical neurotransmitters to communicate with other brain cells. So our brain's activity is intense in the active cells and the resting ones. So we generate in the brain a lot of waste products, and during sleep, we need to get rid of them. We do this by expanding channels, very much like lymph channels in the brain, and we use energy to pump these waste products into these channels, send them out into the body where they can be processed and removed. And that takes energy, so much energy, it would compete with consciousness. So we have to do brain housekeeping while we're asleep. We can't do it while we're awake. And it's getting enough sleep and doing this activity that enables sleep to feel very restful and restorative. Now, we're also experiencing REM stages of sleep. And during REM, we're building neural networks We're putting memories into storage in the brain by adding to our brain's tree structures and firing up old neural networks to keep the brain repairing them. We think this may be one reason why we dream so actively during REM. Also during REM, we build tree structures that are quite intricate. Now, sometimes during our sleeping, we may actually dream during non-REM portions too. And we think this is the way that our brain controls these memories, such that we can actually be plastic during the day and learn new things. For example, you might have spent the day practicing something over and over again and not getting it right. Then you sleep on it, and the next day you find you've learned it. We organize our information into networks during REM. That connects the new learning to older information. The idea that the old dog can't learn new tricks was disproved actually a few decades ago. So please don't think that phrase anymore. In fact, you can even sleep on something and solve a problem in your sleep. And you might say to yourself, I'm not getting anywhere with this. I'm just going to sleep on it and wake up with a new idea. Directed dreaming is actually a way that we can do some treatment for emotional. It's being used as a tool more and more. We also find during REM that the brain replenishes its supply of neurotransmitters, making extra ones. If you've been emotionally overwrought and stressed during the day, you break down neurotransmitters at a very fast rate. You need to get enough time sleeping to replenish them. We need them for learning and memory. So when we think about how we spend a night's sleep, as I said, most of us need 8 to 9 hours, and so much of that REM is happening in the second half of our sleep cycle. So we need to spend enough time sleeping. And if we sleep, say, only 6 hours when we really need 8, we're missing a huge chunk of REM, and that's a problem. Now, how do you know if you're getting enough sleep for you? Well, when you're off for a while, not just a weekend, but say you're off for a week or so, ignore the first couple of nights. But then after that, if you don't have to set the alarm clock, how many hours of sleep are you getting? Then you'll know what your body really wants. Now, genetically, there's about 5% of the population who actually has certain types of genetic variants that they need actually only 4 hours of sleep. And they do a tremendous amount of processing that they need to do during those 4 hours. But most of us, the other 95%, are not like that. So how might we improve our sleep routine? Well, as humans, we're creatures of habit, so we can make habits work for us. So try to have a way that you relax, unwind, or go through some type of regular bedtime routine, so that as you begin to do these things, your body and brain begin to say, oh, we must be getting ready to go to sleep. Try to make sure you have good screening for noise and interruptions and keep the room as quiet as you can. For some people, earplugs may be the only choice, unless, of course, you need to be on call for your job. Now, one of the things that happens as we gear down the body for sleep is that our body temperature begins to dip, reaching, of course, its lowest point around either 3 to 5 or 4 to 6 a.m. or so. And so we can play into that by keeping the bedroom a little bit cooler and, if necessary, using extra window treatments to make that room stay as dark as possible. For some people, their solution may be eye shades. Now, because our body temperature goes into a dip when we're sleeping, we can again play a game with that. You could take a warm bath or shower before going to bed. This increases the body temperature a little bit, maybe 2 to 4 degrees, and then it crashes down again. And that seems to cause our bodies to want to go into a deep, non-REM recuperative sleep more quickly. Also, in cold weather, it helps to keep your feet extra warm. Now, believe it or not, if you're a person who wants to use or is going to try to use melatonin to help you sleep, melatonin also is basically manipulating body temperature. That's how it works. I caution you to avoid blue light before sleeping. The blue end of the spectrum causes the body to decrease its natural production of melatonin, and as a result, causes us to delay production of it, and we stay awake longer, and it takes us a much longer time to get to sleep. Where might you get excessive blue light? Well, you can get it from a computer screen, some types of clock faces, energy efficient bulbs in the fluorescent type, and not the LED. So yes, go change your bulbs out to daylight spectrum LEDs and you'll do a lot better with energy too. Watching TV, in fact, I would suggest if you have a lot of problems sleeping, you may not want to keep a television in the bedroom. It may literally be working against you. Looking at your phone late at night. Sometimes iPads, Kindles, other devices have nighttime settings that you can use, but if they don't, they can inhibit the same melatonin production. So take a look at getting a break from these. Some experts say 30 to 60 minutes before wanting to go to sleep. Get away from these sources of blue light.
Nellie,
Yeah.
I have a question. What would impact on people who only sleep in 2 to 3 hour increments, wake up for a while and fall asleep again for 2 to 3 hours? Why would people have this sleep pattern?
Well, there are several reasons for that, and you might very want to get some good medical consultation on this. But what I'm seeing in the literature is that is suggestive of that. Some of it is diuretics, causing people to need to get up and urinate. Some of it is the caffeine you've taken in and how your body is processing it. It may be, which I'll talk about actually very shortly here, people using a little bit of alcohol to get to sleep, such as a glass of wine. That might have a problem because you might start into some REM rebound, which I'll discuss in a minute. Sometimes people simply have variations in their circadian rhythm. And you may very well have hormonal changes that are rising and falling that are being affected here too. Lots of possibilities here. So it's also possible that you're experiencing some stresses or anxieties that are causing you to wake up. Sometimes, people will call a 3 a.m. Wake up, the hour of the wolf, because that's when whatever is eating at you comes at you and causes you to worry. So that's why it's so important to go after the causes of stress as much as we can. But that's the best answer I can give you. A medical consultation would take you a lot further. Now, I like to suggest that you avoid caffeine near sleep time. It is certainly a diuretic, although not as much as some of the early research used to let us believe, but it can be a problem if you have to kind of get up and urinate. Now, it's also possible to manipulate sleep a bit with food. Keep in mind that protein tends to cause people to be awake or more alert, whereas high carbohydrate foods can induce drowsiness. Now, these carbs don't have to be high sugar, very easily digestible carbs. They could be a little bit slower to digest carbs, but you can do this with food. And you may very well find that whatever you pick as, say, a very late night snack, you might want to avoid too high of a protein content because that can affect sleep. Also, avoid eating very greasy foods before sleep. Unfortunately, those keep the digestive system actively working for such a long time, and that stimulation can disturb sleep as well. And that may be another problem with causing people to come awake through the night. So if you're hungry or thirsty at bedtime, keep it light and small quantity, whether it's a solid food or a drink. Now, this issue of alcohol, I know a lot of times people like to use alcohol to promote relaxation, and it can help people fall asleep, but unfortunately, it can produce an easily disrupted lighter sleep without people getting into the deep stages of sleep that are so restorative. Also, it tends to affect the timing of REM intervals, pushing the REM so that it's suppressed in the first half of sleep and then comes back in a big block in the last part of your sleep cycle. And unfortunately, that can be so intense, it can cause people to wake up with intense dreams, sweating, and headaches as well. Now, also, marijuana use to produce sleep has a very similar effect as well. Now, some other things that we can do that make a difference for stress. making time for fun, what one researcher calls flow activities, because when we do them, we're so caught up in the flow of doing them, we lose track of time. This is real enjoyment. So they could be things we do for recreation. They could be our hobbies. They could be our outside interests, as we call them. They might be lifelong learning that we enjoy as well. So I like to say to you, what sorts of things are you doing for fun? These things often use other parts of the brain than your job does, giving yourself a sense of balance. These are very, very valuable. And if you're not doing these or enough of them, try them out. You might try something new, or you might enjoy rediscovering something you did when you were younger. For example, you might have played a musical instrument when you were young. How about taking it back up again? You know, things that we enjoy make a big difference in life. They give us a lot of good rewards. So I like to say, just get out there and do it. You know, a lot of times the things that we do are living life vicariously. We watch others like actors, we watch athletes, we listen to musicians, but this is passive. What we need to do is actively use our own skills. These are the things that make us feel so good. They lead to personal growth, and they really make us feel balanced, and we feel good about ourselves. Now, it turns out that when I talked earlier about the stress that shrank my brain and affected the hippocampus, it's these flow activities that are challenging and stimulating that reverse this, that regrow the size of the hippocampus and restore its activity back to normal. Now, I do caution you, you know, if you've allowed depression to go on for a long time untreated, we can regrow the hippocampus in size, but not necessarily always recover all of its activity. This is again a reason why chronic stress cannot be allowed to go on for long periods of time. It can take its toll on us in terms of our bodies and brains. Now, flow activities have been found to reduce stress. They are found in people who, again, participate in these longevity studies. They challenge themselves with puzzles and games. They keep learning new things like a new language or a new musical instrument. People who enjoy things are more likely to nurture their own health and are less likely to engage in risky behaviors. And something else that's come out of these longevity studies, it's almost as though these activities create some kind of brain reserve, because people who do these activities either don't go on to experience Alzheimer's or they get a milder case of it than those who do not. Now, the last thing I wanted to share with you is this issue of personal relationships. Humans are such social animals, and the pandemic has been so hard to endure because of it keeping us from interacting as much as we would like with other people. We rely on our social support and our family environment to do a lot to counter stress. Even pets do a lot to reduce our stress levels. Now, of course, I realize not everyone has a great family environment. Maybe we rely more on our friends. It doesn't mean we need lots of friends. We might have a few that we're very close to. Pets have the value of reducing stress because they give us unconditional love. Now, when we do things with others, there's no question that this makes a big difference in our stress levels. Our bodies are prone to release more oxytocin at that time, causing us to feel warm and fuzzy and be more likely to be nurturing towards others. Again, we benefit from this, whether we're men or women. It's just that, yes, oxytocin does seem to work a little better with estrogen than testosterone. But keep in mind, both men and women have some of each other's hormones. We know that people who have social activities, aspects to their lives in which they are not an island, they literally get enriched with others, that they again show an increased lifespan, and it's possible through encouraging healthy habits. We know that married people do tend to live longer than single people, and maybe because our spouses love us and encourage us to go to the doctor. So we're more likely to nurture our health a little bit better. So in conclusion, I'm basically going to say to you, if your personal strategies for dealing with stress that things I've been showing you that you can do for yourself. They're great, but they may not be enough. Just don't let stress go on for too long. Tackle it with both options in your workplace and for yourself. And if it turns out your feelings are indeed too much to bear, seek help. Remember, seeking help is a sign of strength, not weakness. It's a recognition as an adult of our limits. That's a very grown-up thing to do. So when we recognize our limits, like we do with our cars and trucks, and we may not be able to repair our own brakes, we seek out a specialist for this. Why don't we seek out a specialist for taking care of ourselves the same way? So for so much of what we deal with, talk therapy may be all you need. Sometimes medication helps to normalize all those crazy hormonal levels that stress has created in us. But a lot of times, talk therapy by itself is very effective. See what resources are available. Does your workplace have an employee assistance EAP program? Maybe through your health program, lots of community resources are out there. So please seek them out when you need them. So I'm going to stop sharing at this point, and say I'm happy to answer questions here. Are there any further questions, or would people like to ask any questions at this point? Well, I'm going to go down through the participants list then and allow you to talk. And that way, if you wish, you can unmute yourself. So I'm going down through the list here. Let me try and get through everybody. Okay. Alrighty. I think I'm getting everybody done here. Let me see. Yes, I think I have everybody unmuted now. So if you'd like to ask a question, you can unmute yourself if you wish. By the way, if you'd like to do a stress survey in your workplace, I highly recommend you take a look at surveys available at NIOSH, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. They have some great survey tools in there, also as part of their Total Worker Health program. You might find them there as well, but they have some great ones for getting started. And you might find you get your best results if you make them anonymous. That way people may be more likely to share detail with you that they might not otherwise feel they can do.
Natalie, there's a question in the Q&A. Is there such a thing as too much sleep?
Well, here's the thing. If you feel that you're getting enough sleep at night, but you're still feeling sleepy during the day, this is something I talk about in my shift work programs quite a bit, because that can be an indicator of another underlying health problem, especially cardiovascular problems. So it's very good to go out and get yourself a good physical and see if that's the case. For some people, it may be the experience of sleep apnea. And it is true that when some people experience depression, you have, different extremes of how people experience this. For some people, they become frenetic in activity, but for others, they withdraw and they sleep more as a way of escape. So it's important to follow up this kind of issue. It may be your body is telling you something and you need to pay attention to it.
I don't know how to get rid of this stupid screen.
Any other questions? Okay, I have a raised hand from Mr. Baldwin, and I think I've unmuted everybody. You
Yes,
should be unmuted. Yes, so go
Yes,
ahead and ask your question.
okay. I just wondered if there are any resources that you might be able to think of that you could recommend for discussion at, say, in the labor management setting or something like that about, stress and the productivity at work, or something that might be convincing to the employer. You mentioned a number of things like the importance of positive, recognition and so on.
Yes.
If we're trying to convince an employer that it really is important to try to reduce stress, is there anything you can think of that might be helpful?
Yes, that's why I was suggesting the NIOSH surveys and the total worker health surveys.
Okay.
These are a great place to start. But before you issue them, you want to sit down in a labor management setting and explain what you want to do, and also get agreement ahead of time as to how these will be administered and what will be done with the results, so that people don't feel like, well, yeah, they asked us, but nobody did anything about what we said. So I think you want to be able to set the tone for that. And NOSH has some very good resources on how to do that. I also think that among their recommendations are things like, well, you survey, and then you look at the results and you take action on them, and then you survey later to see if those actions worked, because maybe they didn't, or maybe they need some refining or whatever. So I think it pays to get some understandings up front about what how these will be administered, what will be done with the results, who will see the results, and so on. It's also possible that you might consider doing it through a third party, like your EAP program, whatever, if you feel you need that kind of distancing. But there are different ways to approach this. But I would start there with some good resources. I think it's also important, if you try the total worker health approach, theirs looks at many, many different aspects of workplace dimensions. It's a very, very broad survey tool, but it's a very long tool. So before you ask people to fill out that much, you might want to take a look at that one too and see what it can accomplish. But you take little steps at a time. It's also useful to consider approaching stress through the lens of a standard job hazard analysis. Because sometimes this issue is reflected in issues of fatigue, in increases in near misses and things like that. Stress takes its toll in a variety of ways, and for a lot of times, getting feedback on stress can help you negotiate change as well.
Okay, thank you.
That may, management might find that useful too, if it's a change management tool.
Okay, all right, thanks a lot.
Mm-hmm.
There's one other question.
Mm-hmm.
So what about dealing with unvaccinated or unmasked people regarding COVID?
That's my question. Yeah, I mean, I'm semi-retired. When I go out, I have stressful situations dealing with unmasked people, and I'm semi-retired. I can't imagine going to work. And I'm dependent on public transit.
Yes. Sometimes, we have to, what I call, pick your battles right now during the pandemic, such as using public transit at times when it's less densely packed. Sometimes we can't do that. But yes, we are having to deal with people who are, say, able to tolerate a higher level of risk than we are. In which case, we sometimes have to do extra controls ourselves. You might want to bump up your level of protection. For example, You might consider upgrading a face mask to an actual N95 respirator. You may very well have a local clinic that's willing to fit test you for it to make sure you have a good size and shape so it works really well. You might consider using eye protection too. Some people like to go to goggles or a face shield to reduce any impact in the eyes. But for public transit, the issue of face mask wearing where it is mandatory is something that you might need to speak with whoever is in charge of that transport to look at better enforcement. But I tend not to recommend that you try that yourself. In other words, that you go up to someone and say, why aren't you wearing a mask? Because for some people, you may not know that they have a health problem in which they can't wear one, in which case they might get very angry. And some people become violent. So it's not worth it trying to tackle that, one-on-one yourself. These are difficult times to negotiate, it's no question. I get annoyed as well with people who wear a mask or the people who are unclear on the concept, like being in a store one time where the person lowered his mask so that he could cough. That's clearly unclear on the concept. You missed the whole point. Okay, any further questions? Well, then I will say thank you very much for joining us today. We will be posting the recording on the Worker Institute website so that you can refer back to it if you wish. If you have a need for any particular sources or you would like some more references on this, do let me know. My email is my initials, NJB and the number 7. So it's njb7@cornell.edu. Or you can put my name into Cornell's website and you'll be connected to me. I do put out fact sheets on this issue, and I'm happy to provide additional training for people who are interested. And I run much longer programs than 1 hour on it as well, if you're interested in more in-depth work on this. So hope to see you at future webinars, and good to see you all. Take care. And our next webinar will be in January. So happy holidays, everyone, and stay safe.